Welcome to the Underclass Podcast with Austin Picard. I'm an independent researcher who can't stomach being lied to on a daily basis by the mainstream media, while we live in a fracturing society, launched into parallel realities, falling perfectly onto the two sides of the political spectrum. I remain in the underclass. Aldous Huxley once wrote in his dystopian novel, Brave New World, "The real hopeless victims of mental illness are to be found among those who appear to be most normal. Many of them are normal because they are so well adjusted to our mode of existence, because their human voice has been silenced so early in their lives that they do not even struggle or suffer or develop symptoms as the neurotic does. They are normal, not in what may be called the absolute sense of the word. They are normal only in relation to a profoundly abnormal society. Their perfect adjustment to the abnormal society is a measure of their mental sickness. These millions of abnormally normal people living without a fuss in a society to which, if they were fully human beings, they ought not to be adjusted." Episode 6. We awake in the very same profoundly abnormal society, with the goal of dismantling the carefully constructed false narratives surrounding perhaps the most infamous true crime event in all of modern American history, the Manson family murders. Known for bringing an abrupt end to the Summer of Love in 1969, foreshadowing the violent death of the countercultural revolution, the permanent stain on the hippie movement, while paving the way to the crossroads of morality for an entire nation referred to as the Satanic Panic, a phenomena of moral panic and outrage by 1980 in regard to the sweeping accusations of sadistic ritual abuse, paired along with the unnatural rise of cults in America beginning during the 1960s through the 1970s. According to the book Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA and the Secret History of the 60s, authored by Tom O'Neill. Reading early press accounts of Manson and the family, I found it hard to separate hyperbole from veracity. Manson was often made out as an artful seeker, an evil Pied Piper, as one paper put it, with reserves of obscure power. About a week after the family's arrest, a photograph of a wild-eyed Charles Manson, looking for all the world like a modern-day Rasputin, appeared on the cover of Life magazine. Inside the issue, the Manson women, many of them barely teenagers, posed with babies slung over their slender shoulders. They spoke of their love and undying support for Charlie, whom they deemed the second coming of Christ and Satan in one. The media had already started to label the family a nomadic band of hippies and a pseudo-religious cult. The New York Times, striking a dramatic note, claimed that they lived a life of indolence, free sex, midnight motorcycle races, and blind obedience to a mysterious guru inflamed with his power to control their minds and bodies. The underground press, though, had a swell of sympathy for Manson. People thought he was innocent, that his status as a left-leaning communard had been overblown. Tuesday's Child, an LA countercultural paper geared toward occultists, named Manson their Man of the Year. Some didn't even care if he was behind the murders. Bernardine Dorn of the Weather Underground put it most outrageously. "Often those rich pigs with their own forks and knives and then eating a meal in the same room. Far out. The weathermen dig Charles Manson." Charles Manson was born November 12, 1934, to a woman by the name of Kathleen Maddox, who has quite the tragic story in her own right. When she became pregnant with Charlie, Kathleen was a 15-year-old runaway who approached the man she believed to be the father by the name of Colonel Walker Henderson Scott, who proceeded to lie to her and claim he was going away on army business, never to return. She was subsequently rejected by her family who reportedly banished her to Cincinnati, Ohio, in order to give birth in secret, and upon having the child, she wrote on her son's birth certificate, "No name, Maddox." Kathleen had quickly managed to marry a man by the name of William Eugene Manson in August 1934, around 3 months before she would give birth to Charlie. But the marriage wouldn't even last 3 years, as they divorced April 30th, 1937. Charlie would keep the surname Manson. She was showing clear and obvious signs of alcoholism and substance abuse to an extreme almost immediately after giving birth to Charlie, and years later he would frequently retell the story of when he was an infant and his mother was hard up for a drink. She traded her baby to a barmaid for a pitcher of beer. It didn't take long for Kathleen to turn to prostitution and petty crimes, and in an attempt to bankroll her degenerate lifestyle, she would often run amateur scams with her brother Luther. She would offer sexual services to men in order to lure them into a certain area where Luther would proceed to violently rob them. As you would imagine, by August 1939, Luther and Kathleen Maddox were arrested for assault and robbery. She was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment when Charles was only 5 years old, sending him to live with his Aunt Glenna and Uncle Bill Thomas in West Virginia. During this time, I expected some reprieve for young Charlie, finally being away from his mother's unfortunate influence. But instead, according to biographer Jeff Gwynne in his book Manson, The Life and Times of Charles Manson, his uncle reportedly forced him to wear his cousin Joanne's dress to school as punishment for crying in front of his first-grade class. It didn't matter what some teacher had done to make him cry. What was important was to do something drastic that would convince Charlie never to act like a sissy again. An article published at biography.com claims, "From the outset, Charlie caused the Thomases nothing but trouble. He lied constantly, always blamed others for anything he did that was wrong. He was so determined to be the center of attention that he deliberately misbehaved while the grown-ups were around. Even at such an early age, he was fascinated by guns, and especially knives or any other sharp implements. One afternoon, when Charlie was 7, Joanne recalled her parents went out for the afternoon and instructed her to change the bed linens and watch over Charlie. There was no question of Charlie helping Joanne. He always ignored assigned chores. So she sent him out into the yard to play while she changed the sheets in one of the bedrooms. Soon, Charlie came skipping back inside, brandishing a razor-sharp sickle that he'd found in the yard. He waved it in Joanne's face. Bigger and stronger than her scrawny cousin, she pushed him out of the way and continued tucking in the sheets. Charlie jumped between her and the bed. Joanne shoved him outside and locked the screen door behind him. She thought that was the end of it, but Charlie shrieked and began slashing the screen door apart with the sickle. There was a crazy look on his face. Joanne had no doubt that her cousin was going to kill her. He had cut through the screen and was wrenching the door open when Bill and Glenna Thomas drove up. They took in the ravaged screen door, Charlie's furious red face, and Joanne's pale, frightened one, and demanded to know what was going on. So terrified that she could barely speak, Joanne mumbled, "Ask Charles." His version was that she attacked him, and he was only protecting himself. The elder Thomases didn't believe him, and Charlie got a whipping. Of course it didn't make any difference, Joanne remembers. You could whip him all day and he'd still do whatever he wanted. One year, Charlie had received a hairbrush from his grandmother for his only Christmas present, and reportedly he was enraged at the sight of the neighborhood kids with toys of all kinds. Wagons, trains, cowboy hats, and chaps. Manson couldn't stand the humiliation, he said. "One day I rounded up all their toys I could find and carted them home with me. I stacked up some wood and threw the toys on top and started a fire." Shortly after his mother was paroled in 1942, she took custody of her 8-year-old son, moving a number of times until landing in Indianapolis, where Kathleen met a man with the last name Lewis in Alcoholics Anonymous. They were married in August of 1943. HistoryCollection.com, 40 Facts About Charles Manson, the Notorious Cult Leader. reported that the tempestuous marriage only worsened the couple's alcoholism. Charles responded to his new life by skipping school and shoplifting, and soon Kathleen couldn't stand the strain of motherhood. She sent Charles to Gibbolt School for Boys in 1947, which catered to juvenile delinquents. Sick of being flogged by teachers, he soon managed to escape back to his mother, but was immediately sent packing, no doubt causing yet more psychological trauma. Kathleen barely visited Charles at the Gibbolt School, which was a long way from Indianapolis. He later recalled missing his mother terribly. I was lonely, lonelier than I had ever been in my life. He may have been hoping to spend Christmas 1947 with his mother, but instead he found himself once more with Glenna and Bill. At the age of 13, he stole his uncle's gun. It's unclear what he was planning to do, but he was a fairly experienced thief and had no doubt learned a thing or two from Kathleen. Fortunately, he was caught in time. Although his mother had promised him when he was 12 they would live together soon, that time would never come. He would never live with his mother again. Later writing about the experience, I was bitter, and I knew real hate. After the Gibbolt School for Boys, things only got worse for Charlie. In a desperate attempt to escape, he committed a string of robberies, earning his first criminal charge. As the story goes, a sympathetic judge would send him to the infamous juvenile facility in Omaha, Nebraska, known as Boys Town. Boys Town would later be at the center of a major scandal when in 1988, the raid and closure of the Franklin Federal Credit Union in Omaha, Nebraska revealed a child sex trafficking ring, mainly boys and later girls, from Boys Town, Nebraska, that included prominent members of society and government officials as the perpetrators. After spending only 4 days at the Boys Town facility, Manson and another boy managed to escape, obtaining a gun in a stolen car. 2 weeks later, Charlie would be arrested in Peoria, Illinois, and sent to a strict reform school called the Indiana Boys School. According to an interview with Diane Sawyer, he ran away from the school 18 times, accusing the other students of raping him with the encouragement of a staff member, and he was repeatedly beaten. The author Jeff Gwynne wrote in his 2013 book, while at the school, Manson developed a self-defense technique he later called the insane game. When he was physically unable to defend himself, he would screech, grimace, and wave his arms to convince aggressors that he was insane. After a number of failed attempts, he escaped with 2 other boys in February 1951. By the time Charlie was apprehended in Utah driving a stolen car across state lines, which is a federal crime, he would finally be sent to a federal institution in Washington, D.C., called the National Training School for Boys, which was a federal government juvenile correctional institution for offenders under the age of 17. His caseworker deemed him aggressively antisocial after he was given aptitude tests that determined he was illiterate but also had an above-average IQ of 109. Manson was transferred to a minimum security institution by October 1951, and by this time had a parole hearing scheduled for February, but in January he was caught raping a boy at knife point and would find his way back to a maximum security reformatory until his early release on good behavior, May 1954. By 1955, Manson was married to a woman named Rosalie Jean Willis, who was pregnant with his child when they moved to Los Angeles, driving a car Charlie had stolen in Ohio, and once again drove across state lines, committing another federal offense, receiving 5 years probation. Although his probation would be revoked due to a failure to appear at a hearing for an identical charge filed in Florida, which led to a 3-year sentence at Terminal Island in Los Angeles. Not long after his release, he was already in trouble for attempting to cash a forged U.S. Treasury check, which he claimed he had stolen from a mailbox, receiving a 10-year suspended sentence and more probation. By April 1960, an indictment for violation of the Mann Act would lead to another arrest in June because Charlie had violated his probation by pimping out a 16-year-old girl and another woman in New Mexico who had been arrested on charges of prostitution. A year later, he would be transferred to the United States Federal Penitentiary at McNeil Island, Washington. While he was still in Los Angeles County Jail, attempting to appeal the revocation of his probation before he was transferred to McNeil Island, I stumbled onto a very bizarre story told by a fellow inmate you might know well by the name of Danny Trejo, the actor, who just so happened to share the county lockup with Mr. Charles Manson during his sentencing in 1961. He described him as greasy, dirty, scrawny, so poor he didn't have a belt, and instead used a piece of string to keep his pants up. Trejo said in his book that he felt sorry at the time for Manson, who was too small to protect himself. A few days after meeting the notorious criminal, told Trejo and his pals that he had hypnotic powers that could get us high. It was like a guided meditation, Trejo wrote, adding that Manson had the group believing they were smoking marijuana and then injecting heroin, using his words alone. By the time he described it hitting my bloodstream, I felt the warmth flowing through my body, recalled Trejo, who was a teenage heroin addict. If that white boy wasn't a career criminal, he could have been a professional hypnotist. The 1974 book Helter Skelter, the true story of the Manson murders, written by Vincent Bugliosi, reported that in June 1966, Manson was sent for the second time to Terminal Island in preparation for early release. By the time of his release day on March 21, 1967, he had spent more than half of his 32 years in prisons and other institutions. This was mainly because he had broken federal laws. Federal sentences were and remain much more severe than state sentences for many of the same offenses. Telling the authorities that prison had become his home, he requested permission to stay. In an article at The Guardian reviewing Tom O'Neill's book Chaos, we made mention of earlier, the CIA becomes involved when O'Neill starts to wonder why Manson's parole officers were so lax in the years before 1969, allowing him to decamp to San Francisco. It turns out that while living in the psychedelic gulch of Haight-Ashbury, Manson may have been used as a guinea pig or lab rat by a bent doctor who recommended LSD to the government as a means of mind control that could penetrate the heads of informants or prepare so-called Manchurian candidates for service abroad as spies or assassins. Back in Los Angeles, did Manson employ the same methods to program his murderous surrogates? What would typically have been a routine parole violation for any of us was absolutely no concern for Charlie when less than a month after being released from prison in 1967, he absconded to San Francisco, where he was transferred to the supervision of criminology doctoral researcher and federal probation officer Roger Smith at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. The Haight is now known as an MKUltra facility, funded by the CIA through the exploitation of certain medical organizations using them as fronts to conceal its involvement. Roger Smith was a part of a federally funded program researching LSD and drug use among unwitting research subjects, using his position as a parole officer in order to provide an added element of immunity, having the power to send Manson back to prison for numerous violations, yet never doing so. The founder of the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, David Smith, in his book, Love Needs Care, about his time at the Haight, claims that Manson attempted to reprogram their minds to, quote, submit totally to his will through the use of LSD and unconventional sexual practices that would turn his followers into empty vessels that would accept anything he poured into them. It was during his time at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic when Charlie developed the philosophy of an imminent apocalyptic race war, a doomsday scenario he would call Helter Skelter, taken from the name of a song on the recently released Beatles' White Album, released November 1968. According to members of the family, he would speak of a prophecy that all black people in America would rise up and kill all white people except for Manson and his family, but that they were not intelligent enough to survive on their own. They would need a white man to lead them, and so they would serve Manson as their master. Family member Brooks Poston claimed Manson said a group of real blacks would come out of the ghettos and do an atrocious crime in the richer sections of Los Angeles and other cities. They would do an atrocious murder with stabbing, killing, cutting bodies to pieces, smearing blood on the walls, writing pigs on the walls in the victim's own blood. According to the author Jeff Gwynne, Manson family member Paul Watkins testified that Manson would encourage group LSD trips and take lower doses himself to keep his wits about him. Watkins said that Charles' trip was to program us to submit. All of this happened under the supervision of his parole officer Roger Smith and many of the staff at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. Charlie grew his family through drug use and prostitution without any interference from the authorities, and had managed to attract a few more than 20 followers by the time he left the Haight in April 1968. The disastrous Altamont Free Concert was a countercultural rock concert held on Saturday, December 6, 1969, at the Altamont Speedway outside of Tracy, California. Deemed the Woodstock West, with over 300,000 people in attendance. The event is remembered for considerable violence, including the stabbing death of Meredith Hunter and 3 accidental deaths, 2 by a hit-and-run car accident and 1 by an LSD-induced drowning in an irrigation canal. The manager of the Rolling Stones had reached out to the local chapter of the Hells Angels biker gang in order to hire them to run security for the event. During the event, another biker gang referred to by law enforcement as the Hippie Mafia, calling themselves the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, showed up to the event and distributed for free 10,000 individual stamps of a new form of acid to whoever wanted them. Orange Sunshine Acid was a new form of LSD flooding the streets in the summer of 1969 that seemed to possess different qualities than the LSD mostly circulating at the time. Instead of the clean, pure, relaxing high previously experienced, this was an amphetamine-based compound with reports of providing a sensation of being outside of yourself or totally disembodied. A man by the name of Ronald Stark had approached the Brotherhood of Eternal Love with a container holding the equivalent of 50,000 tabs of acid. In other words, at the time, this was approximately the amount of acid that was in all of America. After the disaster at the Altamont Festival, the Brotherhood of Eternal Love quite rightly earned the reputation that this orange sunshine was not very good and could make you go twitchy or go crazy, even potentially cause violent outbursts. By this point, Charlie and the family had moved from San Francisco to Los Angeles, of course, with the permission of his loyal parole officer, Roger Smith, but not without gaining a connection with the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, who began directly supplying them with large amounts of Orange Sunshine LSD. Member of the family Charles Tex Watson wrote in his prison memoir that it was the use of the Orange Sunshine LSD that finally convinced him that Manson's violent apocalyptic vision was real. In 1975, the same Ronald Stark would be arrested in Italy for trying to transport large amounts of hashish from Afghanistan into Italy, where he was brought to trial and made the claim that he had been working for the CIA since the 1960s, and then proceeded to put forward documents of evidence proving it with payslips from Langley, Virginia. Once arriving in Los Angeles, Charlie quickly fell in with the son of actress Doris Day, Terry Melcher, who again, according to Tom O'Neill's book Chaos, Melcher used his mom's beach house to host orgies for a club of priapic buddies known as the Golden Penetrators. Manson, a wannabe rock star, supplied groupies to the revelers in exchange for a promised recording contract with a label Melcher managed for his mother. Among the group now embracing Manson and the family in Los Angeles was celebrity Dennis Wilson, and according to the book Manson, The Life and Times of Charles Manson, for much of the summer he'd been lucky enough to mooch off of the Beach Boys drummer, who was notorious for giving strays temporary run of his luxurious log cabin house further down Sunset Boulevard. Most of them drifted off after a day or two. Manson showed no sign of leaving. For a while that was fine with his host. Besides writing some interesting songs and spouting an addictive form of philosophy about surrendering individuality, Manson had with him a retinue of girls who adored Charlie and were happy to engage in any form of sex his rock star benefactor desired. Accordingly, Wilson's summer was a carnal extravaganza, though he had to make frequent trips to his doctor since the Manson girls kept infecting him with gonorrhea. In between sex romps, Wilson good-naturedly touted Manson's music to the other Beach Boys and to friends in the LA music scene. To date, no one had been impressed enough by Manson's songs to offer the scruffy drifter the recording contract he craved, but Charlie had unwavering belief in his own talent and in Wilson's ability, even obligation, to make it happen. Manson assumed that he was always welcome to come along whenever Wilson went out to a party or to a club. He shared what he had, his music, quirky conversation, and sexually compliant women, and expected Wilson to do the same. It was an unequal arrangement, and lately Wilson was becoming fed up. It was aggravating enough that Manson constantly badgered the drummer to make the Beach Boys record his songs, but the leech and his followers were making a considerable dent in Wilson's personal fortune at a time when the Beach Boys' record sales and concert attendance were in an alarming decline. They'd wrecked his uninsured Mercedes, run up bills with doctors and dentists. They raided Wilson's closets and cut up his clothes to make themselves patchwork robes. Though they espoused scouring supermarket garbage bins for food, they gluttonously emptied Wilson's refrigerator and pantry on a daily basis. They even felt his charge accounts were theirs to use. While he'd been away from home on a brief Beach Boys tour, Wilson's house guests ran up an $800 tab with a local dairy, gorging themselves on the priciest cheese, yogurt, and fruit juice. As much as Wilson embraced the general concept of sharing, he was ready for these master freeloaders to move on. Wilson and Melcher would later claim they began to fear Charlie by this time, saying he had once held a knife to Wilson's throat and asked how the drummer would feel if he killed him. Wilson reportedly muttered, "Do it," and Manson backed off. Terry Melcher was also allowing Charlie and the girls to come hang out and record music at his house around this same time, with promises of a potential recording contract, although it never materialized due to Charlie's inability to take production notes. According to Melcher, Manson would become angry when he attempted to suggest changes in order to produce any of his songs. The house the music producer happened to be living in at the time, with his actress girlfriend Candice Bergen, was at the address 10050 Cielo Drive. As our investigation comes to a close into the hidden truths exposing the experiment that was Charles Manson, we remember a very important government whistleblower by the name of Charles August Schlund III, who discovered the Dombolus papers during the 1970s, which unveiled critical information in regard to the CIA's involvement in the Manson family murders. Schlund went public with allegations saying the war was going badly, and the American people were protesting in ever greater numbers, with pictures of pretty flower girls on TV nightly, protesting. The CIA needed a way of showing the American people that these pretty little flower girls were really Satanists and evil, and that the government was right and just in the war. To do this, the government needed to conduct a massive covert operation to convince the American people that these little flower girls were evil and the free love and peace they talked of was really to cover up evil. Schlund made claims of Charles Manson being a social experiment, and that the CIA had been funding their lifestyle as well as supplying the family directly with drugs. Vincent Bugliosi, author of Helter Skelter, was quoted in The Observer in 2009 and said, "The Manson murders sounded the death knell for hippies and all they symbolically represented. They closed an era, the 60s. The decade of love ended on that night."